Hey, it's Kley. Welcome to another video. This is going to be an overview and explanation of how to use EQ or equalization kind of from a beginner's perspective as it relates to mixing and just in general. I am doing this from the perspective of someone who has trying to look back on my experience in learning how to mix and what it was like for me to go through that, and just to try and remember some of the challenges that I faced and some of the uncertainties, the things that I just had a hard time understanding, and speak to that person. So if you're in that situation where you're just getting into mixing and you don't really understand what a lot of these things are, then hopefully this can be helpful for you. I am in no way a professional with this. I am just an enthusiast, but hopefully I can try to share some of this information. And if anything is wrong and you are more knowledgeable than I am, I welcome any feedback and comments down in the comment section below. But let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, we have to understand what we're talking about when we're talking about using EQ or equalization. So the first thing to understand is that I'm using this program here is called a DAW, a D-A-W, Digital Audio Workstation, and I'm using Reaper. Now, what I'm going to go through hopefully will be something that's easily applicable to any other DAW, but just so you know, this is what I'm working with. So when we're talking about EQ, we're talking about the frequency spectrum. And if I can just go ahead and pull up an EQ plugin here, in Reaper, I'm just going to be using the stock REA EQ plugin, and we're talking about this frequency spectrum right in here from 0 hertz all the way up to 20,000 hertz. And what this does is covering spectrums from low to mids to high treble. So low frequencies down here are going to be your bass drums, your bass guitars. In the mid-range, you're going to have your vocals, your violins, your pianos. On the high end, we're going to have like cymbals or like a flute or something like that. So that's what we're really talking about. We're talking about manipulating that frequency spectrum in such a way that it is easy to understand, and also in such a way that is helpful for your mixes to get better sounds. So what I want to do is talk about using this plugin. I'm going to talk about some of the basic functions that it offers, and just try to give you an introductory understanding. So first and foremost, I want to focus on this type here. We're going to focus on these two to start with. It's called the low pass and the high pass. What this means is, you can see when I went to high pass there, it created this arc here. And what it means is it's kind of an opposite, where what happens is you pick a frequency. So right here I've got 100 hertz picked, and it means that at that frequency point, everything below it is going to be removed from the signal, and everything above it is going to pass. So everything that is higher than 100 hertz is passing through the filter. Everything below is being cut off. Conversely, the low pass is the exact opposite. So we pick a frequency point, 100 hertz, and then everything that is below that point is allowed to pass. Everything above is being filtered out. And these are a nice way to start because they're easy to use. All you really do is you pick a frequency, and that's going to choose where the filter is going to kick in. Now you can control, the gain doesn't do anything here. You can control the bandwidth, which is going to control how steep the curve is, which you can see there. This one's very shallow, very gentle roll off, whereas this one's going to be very sharp. But it's easy to use, meaning you really just pick the frequency. And then they're also kind of easy to understand because, the reality of the situation is whenever you record something, the usable frequency spectrum for that instrument is usually smaller than the total frequency spectrum available. So, for example, let's listen to this acoustic guitar here 1 second, just for a few seconds. Okay, so just a couple of strums on an acoustic guitar here using a microphone, and as you can see, there was a pretty well represented range of spikes going on there. And what I want to focus on here is using some of these pass filters to kind of filter out some of the things that are really unnecessary, parts that are not instrumental to the sound. So I'm going to just start with this high pass. So again, it's meaning that everything above higher is passing through, everything below is being filtered out. So if we play this, and I'm just going to slowly turn this frequency up, and I want you to hear what it does to the sound. Okay, so what I'm hearing is early in this frequency, I paused at about 85. I really was not hearing much of a difference. But then when I got up to about 250 or so, I started to really hear that low end be lopped off. And then when you get up to about 1000, you really starts to sound like you're missing a lot of the signal. So my point is that everything kind of at about 85 and below is really not relevant to the acoustic guitar. So you can use this filter to get rid of that irrelevant stuff. And it's the same thing on the high end. If I make a low pass, and we just put this all the way up and we listen again. Okay, so what I'm doing there is I'm taking high frequencies, and at this point, whatever determined by this number, it is being removed. And you know, at this range from 24 to 19, 18, I was not hearing much of a functional difference. You know, once you get down to about 1,000 or 5,000, you really start to feel like you're losing some of that high-end sparkly brilliance. But everything above that is not necessarily relevant to what you want. And so that's just a good rule of thumb you can use these high and low pass filters as a way to shave off parts of the frequency spectrum that you don't really want or need in your sound. So let's go ahead and move on. I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, but just an introductory as to what the high and low pass do. Next, I want to talk about the bandpass. So there are other types of EQ here, but I'm going to focus on this bandpass. What this does is it picks a certain frequency point, but then it allows you to boost or cut all the frequencies at that point. Now, with the bandpass, it's different because it doesn't shave off everything above or below. It really just focuses at that point. And then there's also a third control, which is this bandwidth, which is also sometimes referred to as the Q. And that is going to determine, you can see how narrow or how wide. So it's more of a surgical approach. You're going into the middle of the signal somewhere and highlighting a specific frequency area, whereas the high and low pass is really taking a frequency higher or lower, and then you only get one or the other, whereas the bandpass is more of a focused approach. So again, we've got three controls. The frequency here determines which frequency is being cut or boosted. That's our second control, gain. You can either cut or boost. This plugin goes all the way up to plus 12. And then your bandwidth here is going to determine the Q, which is again how sharply you surgically step in. So with a very wide Q, you can see, even though my number here is 163, I'm affecting here at 300, at 500, at 50. Whereas if I go with very, very narrow, it's really just 163. And even, if you could zoom in, even 165 or 170 is not going to be affected by an extremely narrow Q or bandwidth. So a very, very helpful type of control to use. So those are the three main functions that I'm going to focus on here with this EQ. And there are others, but we're just going to start with this. Now, I want to talk about, now that we know a little bit of what they do, I want to talk about how you could go about hearing what they do. Because it's one thing to understand in your mind what it does, but it's a whole other thing to hear it. And what I tend to advocate for when you want to listen is to do an opposite extreme type of approach, right? So the goal is, I want to train my ear to try to hear what these different EQ frequencies do to my signal. So let's start with, hey, I want to learn, I've got a high pass here set at 90 hertz. I want to hear what is that doing to my signal. So instead of using a high pass, we're going to do the opposite, which would be a low pass, and we're going to do the extreme, meaning we're going to cut everything. So what this is doing, right, when we have our high pass, Everything below 90 is being removed. Well, in order to know what that is, let's use a low pass, so all we hear is below 90. So all we're going to hear here is what is being removed. So again, let's listen to our acoustic track. Okay, so hopefully what you heard there is a lot of muffled, rumbly, it almost doesn't even necessarily sound like the guitar. I mean, you can kind of vaguely hear the part, but it's a very muffly low end. And that is not pleasant. We don't want that. It's going to create a lot of mud and a lot of unpleasantness. So we're removing that from the signal, and it's kind of subtle. So let's listen to, we'll go back to the high pass now. We'll listen to what the high pass is doing. So it's not a very extremely explicit type of approach. Whereas if I move this up to like 200, you'll really hear it. It's subtle, but I guess it's one of these subtle distinctions that will really start to add up when you make mixing decisions. And I really believe that these types of subtle things can really help. And basically you're trimming the fat. You're removing that muffly low end that you don't really want. So let's go ahead and now check the low pass. I'm going to set this to maybe 13,000 I mean, and let's go ahead and, well, I guess we can leave that on. Let's just listen to this now. So when it's enabled, it's going to smooth that out. Let's just take a listen, and then I'm going to change this to a high pass. So again, opposite extreme. So in order to hear what the low pass does, we listen to the high pass. So let's listen. Okay, so this one I think I set it maybe at a point where you can hear it a little bit more clearly, but if we go back to this high pass and you listen, it's kind of this really scratchy, sizzly, really, really super high frequencies. And so, and again, you can set this wherever you want. If you want to bump it up a little bit to 16 or so, let's try that, and we'll do the high pass. And not a lot of content above 20,000. But again, the idea is that I'm keeping the focused core of my signal, and I am keeping what I really, really want, and I'm trimming the fat of what I don't really need. So that's just a nice way to help you start to learn about what these different things do. Okay? All right, so now I want to do the same thing with a bandpass. So let's go ahead and keep our high and low pass the way they are, and let's listen to what a bandpass does. This is a really effective tool, I think. So we're going to pick a frequency at, let's say, 1,000, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to boost it up all the way to 12. Again, opposite extremes. So in order to hear what's going on here, I'm going to put this to the extreme, maybe turn my Q down a little bit so it's kind of narrow, boost it all the way up to 12, and let's listen to that. Okay, so I was kind of sweeping it around there, and what I'm doing is I'm listening for how each of these frequencies are affected when you really boost them up. That's how you can really tell their true colors, so to speak, of what's going on there. And again, this is just an effective tool to hear what is going on, so that can help you start to make decisions as you train your ears. Okay, next I want to talk about the concept of, we've talked about how these tools work. Let's talk about something that I call subtractive EQ. And this is more of a higher end approach and in a more of a meta level, what is my goal with mixing? There are so many different ways you can go about mixing, but from a beginner's perspective, I think it's helpful if you have some sort of goals, right? If you just start coming in with an EQ and you start doing stuff, you don't really have a direction. I guess you just want it to sound better. Well, what does that mean? This is one way to kind of help you, give you some framework or some guidelines as to how to use that. And this is called a subtractive EQ type of approach. So the basic idea is that we're going to use potentially a number of different gentle cuts to pull frequencies out of the mix in a way that just kind of massages the sound and helps it to be the best it can be, trimming the fat, right? So we've got, on one hand, we've got a low pass here, cutting out a little bit of low end. We've got a high pass here, cutting out a little bit of high end. Now let's do a little bit of bandpass work here to try and potentially trim up some of the rest of this audio signal. So what I do here is, again, boost it up to 12, remove my bandwidth down a little bit, and I'm just going to do kind of what we did before, where I'm going to listen to the track, and I'm going to move this frequency up and down, and I'm listening for a particular place where the sound is kind of what I call offensive or harsh, and it kind of makes you wince a little bit, like, ooh, that's not very good. That's what we're looking for, and this is how we find it, by boosting up to 12. So let's listen for a minute and try to find some. Okay, can you guys hear that? It's kind of like this low mid-range type of a deal. Let's toggle. Okay, so I found a frequency that I don't really like, and in this 250 range, just from experience, it tends to be where some of these lower mids tend to kind of funnel up, and it gets really muddy. So I'm going to put it to about -3, and it's a subtle difference. I don't know if you'll really be able to hear it when I toggle. But the idea is that if you do a couple of these, with these high and low pass filters, some just gentle tweaking and shaping, your overall sound in the end will just be a little bit more pleasant, and you'll remove some of the harsher frequencies that you don't really like. So let's add another one. I'm going to start off kind of where I left off. I'm hearing something there I don't really love. I'm just going to take it out by -2. Let's add another one and keep going. All right, I'm kind of happy with where they're at. Most of my cuts here are focused kind of in this lower mid-range to really kind of prevent the acoustic guitar from being kind of muddy. I'm leaving the high end up a little bit, and I might even change a little bit of this low pass just to make sure that I get the brightness out that I want. But again, this is subjective. It's all up to you and what you like. There really are no presets when it comes to mixing. It's not as if you can just copy these settings and apply it to your acoustic guitar and it will sound great. It's going to depend on your playing and your guitar and your pick and your room and your microphone. All of those things are going to be slightly different, and so it's all about finding what you like and what sounds pleasing to you. But just for in a second, I want to listen to the whole thing, and when I check this box, I'm adding or subtracting all of these EQs at once, so you can hear the before and after. So again, not a tremendous change, but a subtle change, one that will hopefully make this guitar just sit a little bit better in a mix and just overall be less offensive. And again, just a subtle way to get things to sound a little bit better. And also another thing I want to touch on is, one of the things I noticed a little bit is because we're kind of cutting a little bit more on the lower end, even though we haven't boosted any treble, the whole sound sounds a little bit brighter because when you cut something, the other frequencies that are not cutted get a kind of a secondary effect of being like kind of boosted. Their relative effect is boosted because the other frequencies are being taken away. So they have a chance to stand out a little bit better. If let's say you're in third place and the first and second place people are injured, well, suddenly you get bumped up to first. You maybe aren't necessarily running any faster, but because your competition has fallen back, you are put into first place relative to them. So just a nice way that kind of helps it stick out. And the other thing about boosting, if you can hear when I was doing those big 12 dB boosts, it makes the sound really kind of sharp and harsh. Whenever you boost, you're adding something that was not there previously. Whereas cutting is a little bit more natural, a little bit true to the source, at least in my opinion, because it's less invasive. You're not adding something, you're just taking away, trimming out a little bit of the fat, but the core of what you really like is still there. Okay, so then last I want to talk a little bit about, so a lot of what we've been doing so far has been using EQ as more of a kind of a basic, straightforward way, but there are also some more fun things that you can do with EQ, some tricks that you can use, and I want to talk a little bit about that. So, for example, one of the things that you may have heard on some of your records is you can get kind of this effect going on. So what I've done here is I've done a high and low pass to really like cutting everything below 500 and everything above 2700. And so let's listen to what that does. It almost creates this AM radio type of effect, and sometimes it can be fun to like let that go for maybe like the intro or the first time you play a riff, and then at some point you turn that off and the full frequency comes in and it sounds really huge and fat. Yeah, so it's just kind of a way that you can make the sound really seem to punch out. Can be definitely a cool effect to use sometimes, and certain some bands and some intros have made great effect of that to sound really cool. And then let's talk about one more trick. One of the things you can do, it won't probably work here because I'm in a kind of a home recording situation, but let's say you've got an acoustic guitar that's really presenting a lot of troubles of like feedback or something. Well, if you can let's say the guitar, kind of when I was doing this type of stuff, on something like this, I had this frequency that didn't sound very good to me. You boost it up to 12, holy cows, that really is what makes it bad. You could do a very, very narrow, let's say it was at 300. You could do an extremely narrow, cut it all the way out, and just cutting a single frequency or maybe just a couple of frequencies. And what that can do is fix like a feedback problem that you're having. If you find that frequency that's feeding back, then you can almost eliminate it and fix the problem there just by using an EQ. So just a couple of tricks to help improve your mixing. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please let me know your thoughts down below, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.